My entitled mom tried to hospitalize my wife. Now she's homeless and divorced. They tell you that Thanksgiving is a time for gratitude, family, and reflection. They paint pictures of golden brown turkeys, warm hearths, and generations gathered around a table sharing stories. But if you grew up in my house, Thanksgiving was less of a holiday and more of a psychological war zone. My mother, Beatrice, treated every family gathering like a high-stakes chess match where she always had to be the smartest, most dominant person in the room. If you had told me that her obsessive need to be right would end with her favorite son-in-law being hauled out of her dining room on a stretcher, with police lights flashing through the neighborhood, I wouldn't have believed you. But then again, arrogance has a funny way of blinding people to the collateral damage they are about to cause. My wife, Sarah, is the kindest, most patient woman I've ever met. She is a pediatric physical therapist, meaning she spends her days helping children learn to walk again. She is practically a saint. But to my mother, Sarah was an interloper, a threat to the family dynamic, and worst of all, someone who didn't bow to Beatrice's every whim. The cornerstone of my mother's hatred for Sarah revolved around a single, undeniable medical fact. Sarah has a severe, life-threatening allergy to truffles. Not a dislike, not an intolerance. A full-blown, throat-closing, EpiPen requiring anaphylactic allergy to the fungus and the synthetic compounds used in truffle oil. To a rational person, this just means you don't cook with truffles when Sarah is around. To my mother, it was a direct insult. Beatrice is the kind of woman who believes allergies were invented by millennials in the late 90s to get attention. She genuinely believed Sarah was faking the allergy to be difficult and to assert dominance over my mother's cooking. For 3 years of our marriage, I had to be a hawk at every family dinner, constantly questioning my mother about ingredients. We had fights about it. We had screaming matches in her driveway. I drew a hard line. If she ever messed with Sarah's food, we were done. She swore up and down she would respect the boundary, always with that sickeningly sweet, patronizing smile that told me she was lying through her teeth. Then came my sister, Megan, and her husband, Greg. Greg was the golden son-in-law. He was a corporate lawyer, drove a Porsche, and complimented my mother's hair every time he saw her. Beatrice adored him. What Beatrice willfully ignored, however, was that Greg had recently been diagnosed with a severe neurological condition. To manage it, his doctors had put him on an incredibly strict regimen of older, heavy-duty MAOI medications. For those who aren't familiar with pharmacology, MAOIs come with a massive, highly restrictive diet. You absolutely cannot consume high amounts of tyramine, a compound found in aged cheeses, cured meats, and specifically concentrated fermented fungi and artisanal truffle products. If you do, it triggers an acute, life-threatening hypertensive crisis. Your blood pressure skyrockets to stroke levels, your heart practically vibrates out of your chest, and your organs start to shut down. Greg's doctors were adamant about his diet, and Greg followed it religiously. That brings us to Thanksgiving Day. Sarah and I arrived at my parents' house around 2 in the afternoon. What my mother didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Sarah was 7 weeks pregnant with our first child. We hadn't announced it because it was still early, but the pregnancy was already making its presence known. Sarah was suffering from brutal, relentless morning sickness that lasted all day. The mere smell of heavy food made her turn pale. We agreed on the drive over that she would just politely pick at some plain mashed potatoes and a dry dinner roll, and we would leave as early as socially acceptable. When we walked into the house, the air was thick with the smell of roasting turkey, butter, and something else. Something heavy, earthy, and pungent. I immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother hovering over a massive gravy boat, stirring it with a look of intense, manic concentration. "What's in the gravy, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She jumped slightly, then quickly plastered on her usual innocent smile. "Just the turkey drippings, butter, flour, and a little bit of thyme. Honey, the usual. I made it extra special this year." I stared at her for a long moment. I didn't see any bottles of truffle oil on the counter. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Dinner was served at 5 o'clock. The dining room table was a sprawling display of culinary excess. My father, my sister Megan, Greg, Sarah, my mother, and I all sat down. Almost immediately, my mother picked up the gravy boat. She bypassed everyone else and shoved it directly toward Sarah. "Sarah, darling, you simply must try the gravy this year," Beatrice said, her eyes wide and unblinking. "I spent hours on it. It's my absolute best batch yet. Pour a lot of it on your turkey. Sarah smiled weakly, looking slightly green from the overpowering smell of the food. Thank you, Beatrice. But I think I'm just going to stick to the rolls today. My stomach has been acting up a bit. Everything looks wonderful, though. My mother's face fell, instantly replaced by a tight, furious grimace. Your stomach is upset? On Thanksgiving? Oh, please, don't be ridiculous. It's just gravy. It's not going to kill you. Mom, I warned, my voice dropping an octave. She said no. Leave it. Beatrice slammed the gravy boat back onto the table, the ceramic clinking sharply. Fine. Be ungrateful. I slave away in the kitchen for 2 days. And she won't even taste it. Typical. She crossed her arms and glared at Sarah, entirely consumed by her own bitter rage. Because she was so hyper-focused on her failed attempt to expose Sarah, she completely ignored what was happening to her right. Greg, who was starving and had absolutely no sense of the tension in the room, happily grabbed the gravy boat. Well, if Sarah doesn't want it, I'll take it. I love your gravy, Beatrice. Greg proceeded to absolutely drown his plate. He poured thick, dark pools of the gravy over his turkey, his mashed potatoes, and his stuffing. He must have used a third of the boat. He took a massive bite, chewed, and smiled. Wow, that is rich, really earthy flavor this year. What is that? My mother, still glaring daggers at Sarah, waved her hand dismissively. Just my secret recipe, Greg. Eat up. The meal continued in awkward silence. I held Sarah's hand under the table, silently promising her we would leave in 20 minutes. It took exactly 15 minutes for the nightmare to begin. I was mid-conversation with my father about baseball when I heard a strange, wet, gasping sound. I looked across the table. Greg had dropped his fork. His face was no longer its normal complexion. It was an alarming, deep shade of crimson, bordering on purple. Sweat was pouring down his forehead in thick sheets, dripping into his eyes. Both of his hands were clamped over his chest, his knuckles white. Greg, Megan asked, her voice laced with sudden panic. Honey, what's wrong? Greg tried to speak, but only a strained, wheezing croak came out. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide, darting around the room wildly. Suddenly, a violent tremor seized his entire body. He violently pushed himself away from the table, his chair tipping over backward with a loud crash. He hit the hardwood floor, his hands flying to his head as if his skull was splitting open. My head, he screamed, a sound of pure agony. My chest, it feels like it's exploding. Chaos erupted. Megan dropped to her knees beside him, screaming for help. My father froze in shock. I vaulted over the table, pulling my phone out of my pocket and dialing 911 before I even hit the floor next to him. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher answered. I need an ambulance immediately. My brother-in-law is collapsing. He's sweating, completely flushed, complaining of extreme head and chest pain. He's on MAOI medications. As I relayed the address, Greg began to convulse slightly, his breathing becoming shallow and frantic. He was experiencing a textbook, catastrophic hypertensive crisis. His blood pressure was likely surging past the 200 mark. The dispatcher told me paramedics were 3 minutes away. I stayed on the floor with Greg, helping Megan keep him on his side. I looked up at the table. My mother was standing there, pale as a ghost, staring at the spilled plate of food. The paramedics burst through the front door, bags in hand. They rushed into the dining room, immediately taking over. One strapped a blood pressure cuff to Greg's arm, while the other prepared in for. BP is 220/140, the paramedic shouted, his professional calm breaking slightly. He's stroking out. Sir, what did he eat? We need to know exactly what he ingested. Any alcohol? Any aged foods? You said. He's on MAOIs. Just turkey, potatoes, stuffing. Megan cried hysterically. Normal Thanksgiving food. Nothing aged. The paramedic looked around frantically. This is a severe tyramine reaction. Something on this table is loaded with it. Think. Did anyone use a marinade? Fermented sauces. I slowly stood up. I walked over to the table and picked up the gravy boat. I brought it to my face and took a deep, deliberate inhale. Beneath the smell of roasted turkey fat and flour, there was the unmistakable, overpowering stench of concentrated, artisanal truffle paste. Not the cheap synthetic oil, but the real, heavily fermented, tyramine-rich stuff that cost a fortune. I turned to my mother. She was shaking, her hands covering her mouth. her eyes darting between me and the paramedics working frantically on Greg. "Mom," I said, my voice dead and cold. "What did you put in the gravy?" She shook her head rapidly, backing away against the wall. "Nothing. I didn't. It was just a little bit." "What did you put in it?" I roared, a sound I didn't even know I could make. The entire room went dead silent, save for Greg's ragged breathing and the beeping of the paramedic's monitor. My mother burst into tears, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah, who was standing quietly in the corner, horrified. I just wanted to prove she was lying. Beatrice wailed, completely oblivious to the man dying on her floor. "She's always lying. I spent $100 on pure artisanal black truffle paste. I mixed the whole jar into the gravy. I just wanted her to eat it and be fine so you would see she's a manipulative liar." Megan let out a sound that I can only describe as the scream of a wounded animal. She lunged at our mother, but my father intercepted her, holding her back as she thrashed and sobbed. "You poisoned him," Megan screamed. "You poisoned my husband." The paramedics didn't wait to hear the rest. Having identified the trigger, they immediately administered a fast-acting blood pressure reducer and loaded Greg onto a stretcher. They rushed him out the front door, the red and blue lights of the ambulance casting long, chaotic shadows across my mother's meticulously manicured front lawn. Megan ran out after them, jumping into the back of the ambulance before the doors slammed shut. The house was suddenly terribly quiet. My father was leaning against the wall, his face buried in his hands, openly weeping. Sarah stood beside me, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. My mother looked at me, tears streaming down her face, still trying to find a way to make herself the victim. "I didn't mean to hurt Greg. You have to believe me. It was just a prank. It was just to show you who Sarah really is." "I know exactly who Sarah is," I said quietly, the absolute finality in my voice surprising even me. "She's the woman who is carrying your first grandchild, a grandchild you will now never, ever meet." My mother's face went entirely slack. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization of what she had just destroyed hit her like a physical blow. I took Sarah's hand, grabbed our coats, and walked out the front door. We didn't look back. Greg spent 4 days in the intensive care unit. The massive influx of tyramine had caused severe stress on his heart and minor, though reversible, kidney damage due to the spike in blood pressure. He survived, but it was a terrifyingly close call. His doctors explicitly stated that if he had eaten even a few more spoonfuls, or if the paramedics had arrived 2 minutes later, he would have suffered a massive, fatal stroke. The fallout was absolute and nuclear. Greg's parents are not people you cross. His father is a retired federal judge, and his mother comes from old money. When they found out that my mother had deliberately spiked the food with a toxic allergen just to settle a petty vendetta with a different daughter-in-law, they didn't just get mad. They got litigious. They filed a massive civil lawsuit against my mother for gross negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and all of Greg's staggering out-of-network ICU medical bills. My mother tried to fight it, claiming it was a mistake. But the paramedics' written report included her exact quote. "I mixed the whole jar into the gravy to prove she was lying." It was an open and shut case of premeditated food tampering. My parents' homeowner's insurance flat out refused to cover the liability, citing the intentional nature of the act. To settle the lawsuit and keep herself out of criminal court for reckless endangerment, my mother had to liquidate her retirement accounts and sell the beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house where we grew up. My father, finally broken by decades of enabling her toxic behavior and devastated by the loss of his savings, filed for divorce 3 months later. He moved to a small condo in Florida. Megan and Greg instituted a strict, legally backed no-contact order against Beatrice. As for Sarah and me, we changed our phone numbers and moved on with our lives. 7 months later, we welcomed a healthy, beautiful baby girl into the world. We celebrated our first Thanksgiving as a family of 3 in our own home. The food was simple, the house was quiet, and there wasn't a single drop of gravy on the table. And honestly, it was the best meal I've ever had.